Tonight we revisit one case that has never been permitted to close, though the man at its center was sentenced, imprisoned, and long ago buried. One island, one marriage, one death whose cause was never settled beyond dispute, and which entered the national record and has remained there. It is a case in which the conviction stands to this day, unreversed, and in which the doubt has proved every bit as durable as the verdict. The case of Sarah Maria Louisa Kirwan begins at Howth, on the northern arm of Dublin Bay, in the late summer of the year 1852. Howth in that decade was a place of two characters held uneasily together. It was, first, a working fishing village, its harbour thick with the smell of the catch, its quay walls lined with the boats and the men who kept them, its economy turned toward the water and the daily labour of drawing a living from it. The great harbour had been built in the early part of the century in the hope that Howth would become the principal packet station for the mails between Dublin and Holyhead, and though that ambition had passed to Kingstown to the south, the works remained. A long pier, a lighthouse at its head, a body of water sheltered from the open sea. The place had the settled, slightly disappointed solidity of a town built for a purpose it had not been permitted to fulfill. Its second character was newer, and it was the character that concerns this account. By the middle of the century, Howth had become a resort. The railway from Dublin had reached it in the previous decade, and the journey from the city, a distance of some 9 miles, could now be made in well under an hour, which placed the village within the easy reach of the professional and merchant families of the capital who wished to take lodgings by the sea for the warmer months. Such families came for the air, for the walks along the cliffs of the head, for the bathing, and for the view across the water to the small, uninhabited island that lay a little under a mile off the shore. The lodging houses of the village received these visitors each summer, and the boatmen of the harbour carried them back and forth across the short stretch of sea for a fixed and modest fee. The island was called Island's Eye. The name has nothing to do with sight. It is a corruption reaching back through the centuries to the Norse, in which the final syllable meant simply island, so that the whole reduces in the end to a repetition, the island called Island. It was a place of rough grass and rock, perhaps a mile in circumference, rising to a low summit at its eastern end. Upon it stood two structures. One was a Martello Tower, one of the chain of squat defensive towers thrown up along this coast during the Napoleonic alarms earlier in the century, and by 1852 long disused. The other was the ruin of an ancient church, said to date to the 8th century, a foundation associated with the early Irish saints, its walls broken and open to the weather. Between the tower and the church, the ground fell away on the seaward side into a series of rocky inlets, and one of these, a narrow cleft that filled and emptied with the tide, was known to the boatmen and the local people by the name of the Long Hole. It was a place people visited by daylight and left before dark. There was no habitation upon it, no keeper, no shelter beyond the empty tower and the roofless church. A party set down there in the morning was, in the plainest sense, alone until the boat returned for them in the evening. It is the Long Hole, and the arrangement by which the island was reached and left, that will recur. The woman whose death is the subject of this account was born Sarah Maria Louisa Crowe, in or about the year 1824. She is known to history almost entirely through the circumstances of her ending, and the record offers comparatively little of her early life beyond what can be recovered at its edges. The precise details of her parentage, her father's occupation, and the place and manner of her upbringing are not established with certainty in the primary sources most readily recovered, and where later writers have supplied such details, they have not always agreed among themselves. What can be said with confidence is that her mother survived her, and would in due course be called to speak on oath concerning her daughter's marriage, a fact that will return, and that carries a particular weight, for a mother's testimony in such a matter is not lightly given. She married William Burke Kirwan, an artist of Dublin, and by his own later statement they had been married about 9 or 10 years by the summer of 1852, which would place the marriage in the early part of the 1840s, when she was still a very young woman. Other accounts have set the union at a somewhat longer span. The discrepancy is small and turns on how the years were counted, but it is noted here because the habit of this account is to mark where the sources diverge, rather than to smooth them into a false certainty. The couple had no children between them. They resided in Dublin at number 11, Upper Merrion Street, an address of some standing in the Georgian core of the city, among the houses of the professional and the comfortable. Of her appearance, the record preserves two kinds of witness, and both must be understood for what they are. The first is testimony. Those who saw her at Howth and on the island in her last days described her, at the trial and in the newspapers, as a remarkably fine-looking woman, and such descriptions, offered after the fact by people summoned to recall her, are representations shaped by the occasion of their giving, rather than independent measurements of the living person. The second is more unusual and belongs to the particular nature of the man she had married. Kirwan was a painter, and among the works attributed to his hand is a portrait of a seated young woman in a straw hat, understood to be Maria herself. If the identification is correct, then the woman at the center of this case looks out at us still, in pigment, through the eye and the hand of the man who would be convicted of her killing. That is as near as the record permits us to come to her face. It is not near enough to know her. In the summer of 1852, the Kirwans left Merrion Street and took lodgings at Howth for the season, in a house let to them by a woman named Margaret Campbell, and there they lived for some 5 or 6 weeks. The husband was frequently absent, understood by those about them to be in the city upon his business. The wife remained. She was fond of bathing, and it was her habit, when her husband crossed to Island's Eye to sketch, to accompany him and to pass the day upon the island, in walking and in swimming while he worked. This was their arrangement through that summer, the short crossing in a hired boat, the day upon the rocks and in the water, the return at evening. It was an entirely ordinary pleasure of the season. On the 6th of September it was undertaken as it had been undertaken many times before. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. The man who had married her, and who would be tried for her death, was William Burke Kirwan, born in Dublin in or about the year 1814, into a family of some artistic connection. He was trained as a painter, having studied under the portraitist Richard Downes Bowyer, and in the 1830s and 1840s he had exhibited work at the Royal Hibernian Academy, the principal institution of its kind in the country. He was not a figure of the first rank in his profession, but neither was he negligible. He was described half a century afterward as an artist of no mean order, and examples of his work are held in national collections to this day. Alongside his painting, he practiced the allied trades by which such a man supported himself. He worked as an engraver, as a cleaner and restorer of pictures, and, the detail that later observers found difficult to set aside, as an anatomical draftsman, one who made careful drawings of the dissected human body for the instruction of medical students. He was, in the ordinary reckoning of the city, a respectable professional man of middling means, and he was so regarded by those who knew him in his public character. His private character was another matter, and it is the discovery of that private character, rather than any single act upon the island, that turned suspicion toward him and shaped everything that followed. For some years, Kirwan had maintained a second household. In it lived a woman named Maria Teresa Kenny, who was known in her own neighborhood as Mrs. Kirwan, and who had borne him a number of children. The sources say 7 or 8, of whom 7 survived. He divided his time between the two establishments, keeping the one at Merrion Street with his lawful wife, and the other with Teresa Kenny and their children, and the frequent absences that his wife's neighbors had understood as business in the city were, in substantial part, the maintenance of this parallel family. The exact address of the second household is given differently in different accounts. Sandymount Avenue, and Lower Dorset Street have each been named, and the disagreement is itself a small instance of how imperfectly even the central facts of the case were fixed. The relationship between the husband and the wife, in the light of this discovery, was reconstructed after her death by those who had observed it, and here the record must be handled with particular care. Neighbors at Howth and at Merrion Street would testify that the couple had been heard to quarrel, and one witness alleged that Kirwan had used his wife with violence. Against this stood the sworn word of Maria's own mother, who declared that he had always been to her daughter a kind and affectionate husband. The two accounts cannot both be complete, and the record does not permit us to say with certainty which weighed nearer the truth of the marriage as it was actually lived. What the second household supplied, in the eyes of those who came to suspect him, was a motive, a reason why a man might wish his wife removed. Whether it was in fact his motive, or any part of it, is a matter the primary materials establish only by inference, and never by his own admission, for Kirwan protested his innocence to the end, and made no confession at any stage. On the morning of the 6th of September, at about 10 o'clock, William and Maria Kirwan were carried across to Island's Eye by a small crew of boatmen, among them Patrick Nangle and his kinsman Michael Nangle. The arrangement was the usual one. The couple would spend the day upon the island, and the boat would return for them in the evening, at about 8 o'clock. Maria bathed soon after landing, at the strand near the Martello Tower, but did not remain long in the water, for the boatmen had a second party to convey to the island, and could not wait upon her. Through the day the couple were seen upon the island by others. One boat that touched there offered Maria a passage back to the mainland. She declined it, saying that a boat would come for them in the evening as arranged. In the later part of the afternoon, at about 6 o'clock, she left her husband. He was at his sketching, by his account, upon the higher ground toward the east, working at the effect of the declining sun upon the mountains across the bay, and told him that she would bathe once more, and then walk about the hill and meet him at the boat. That is the last exchange between them that the record preserves. She was not seen alive again by any witness whose account survives. What happened upon the island in the 2 hours that followed cannot be narrated, because no one has ever been able to say. There was no witness upon Island's Eye but the two of them. What the record does contain is sound. Shortly before 8 o'clock, several persons upon the shore at Howth, nearly a mile distant across the water, heard cries coming from the direction of the island. One of them, a man named Hugh Campbell, a fish driver, leaning upon the quay wall opposite the lighthouse, heard a weak voice from the eastward calling, as he understood it, for assistance. He heard more than one such cry, the second some minutes after the first, the third soon after that, and to his ear the cries did not strengthen. The words, if there were words, could not be made out at that distance. Other witnesses gave a similar account. The number of cries, their character, and whether they grew weaker are matters upon which the testimony was pressed hard at the trial, for a great deal was thought to hang upon them. When the boat returned at the appointed hour, Kirwan was upon the shore alone. He told the boatman that he had not seen his wife for some hours, and that they had been separated. By his account, he had continued at his work while she bathed. A search was begun and continued into the failing light and the gathering dark. It was Patrick Nangle who at length found her. Her body lay upon the rocks at the long hole, at the water's edge, as the tide drew back. She was partly unclothed. There was blood about her. A wet sheet was found near the body, a circumstance to which later significance would be attached, and which was never fully explained. The manner of her death is the whole of the case, and it is precisely here that the record refuses to close. What can be stated is that she was found dead upon the rocks of an inlet in which she was known to have gone to bathe, at a place where the incoming and retreating tide made the shore treacherous. What cannot be stated, on the strength of the primary materials, is the manner by which she came to be dead. The sequence as it was afterward reconstructed through the proceedings placed her in the water at the long hole in the last hour of daylight. Beyond that placing, the reconstruction becomes contested at every point, and this account will not pretend to a certainty that the evidence never supplied. The first official finding was not murder. A coroner's inquest was held, and it returned the verdict that Maria Kirwan had been found drowned. The doctor who examined the body in the first instance reported that he had seen no marks upon it sufficient to arrest his attention, and no clear trace of violence. Upon that verdict she was buried. Had the matter rested there, the death of Maria Kirwan would have passed into the ordinary melancholy record of the sea's accidents, one bathing death among many along that coast, and no more would have been heard of it. It did not rest there, and what disturbed it was not new evidence but talk. In the weeks after the burial, rumour worked through Howth and through Dublin. The quarrels that neighbours had overheard were repeated and enlarged. The allegation that Kirwan had ill-used his wife was circulated. And then, decisively, the fact of the second household became generally known. The woman called Mrs. Kirwan, who was not the dead woman, the 7 surviving children, the divided life. Once that was known, the drowning at the Long Hole was no longer read as an accident, but as an opportunity, and the reading spread faster than any authority could govern it. The pressure of that rumour, rather than any fresh discovery upon the island, is what reopened the case. About a month after the burial, in October, the body of Maria Kirwan was exhumed for a fresh examination. The circumstances of that examination were, from the outset, unsatisfactory, and their unsatisfactoriness would shadow everything built upon them. The body had lain a month in the ground. It had been buried, moreover, in wet ground, which hastened its decay, and the post-mortem was therefore conducted upon remains already substantially altered by the processes of decomposition. Whatever the examination found, it found upon a body no longer in the condition it had been when it lay upon the rocks, and the difficulty of distinguishing the marks of a death from the marks of a month underground would prove to be the hinge upon which the medical dispute turned. On the day of the exhumation, or very near it, Kirwan was arrested. When the officers of the Dublin Metropolitan Police came to take him, they found at the house his second family, the mistress and some of the children, so that the domestic arrangement that had furnished the rumour with its motive was confirmed to the authorities in the very act of the arrest. He was charged with the willful murder of his wife and committed to await his trial. The 2 lines of the matter, the death upon the island and the private life of the man, had converged and would not again be separated. The medical evidence was given principally by Dr. George Hatchell, the surgeon who conducted the examination upon the exhumed body, and it is the most closely disputed evidence in the entire case. His difficulty was fundamental, and he did not conceal it. So much time had elapsed between the death and the examination, and the body was so far decayed that the forming of a confident opinion was, in his own word, hazardous. He had at one stage allowed that either drowning or strangulation might account for what he observed. At the trial, however, he told the jury that in his judgment the cause of death was asphyxia, and that the degree of congestion he had found, together with other appearances, was greater than he would expect to see in a case of simple drowning. Something more than the water, he suggested, had been at work, a constriction, a pressure of some kind. He did not, and on the state of the remains could not, specify the instrument of that pressure. Under the cross-examination of the defence, the certainty of this opinion was worked upon and gave ground. Hatchell conceded that the appearances might be consistent with the deceased having struggled in the water on her own account, and the concessions he made left the medical case markedly less firm than his direct testimony had made it seem. The condition of the body imposed limits that no skill could overcome, features that in a fresh examination might have decided the question between accident and violence had been lost to the month in the wet earth. What physical evidence was absent mattered as much as what was present, and much was absent. Against the prosecution's medical case there stood, in time, a formidable body of contrary opinion. The defence advanced the possibility that Maria Kirwan had suffered a seizure, that she was subject to epilepsy, and had been taken by a fit while bathing, perhaps brought on by entering the water after a full meal, and had drowned in consequence, without any hand upon her. Beyond the courtroom, as the case became a public controversy, medical men of standing declared themselves. A memorial was got up in which some 10 eminent doctors held that the death was consistent with natural causes, that she had drowned. And the most authoritative voice of all in these matters, Alfred Swain Taylor, the preeminent medico-legal writer of the age, gave it as his opinion that no murder had been committed at all. It was even argued, then and afterward, that some of the marks upon the body, which had been read as signs of violence, were the work of the sea itself, of the crabs and creatures of the shore, acting upon the flesh after death. The medical record, in short, did not speak with one voice. It was made to yield a conclusion, and a great part of the profession believed the conclusion was not in it. The trial opened at the Commission Court, held at the courthouse in Green Street in Dublin, on the 8th day of December in the year 1852, and continued into the 9th. Upon the bench sat two judges, the Honourable Mr. Justice Philip Cecil Crampton of the Court of Queen's Bench, and the Right Honourable Baron Green. Crampton was by then a man of advanced years and long experience, born in Dublin in 1783, a former Solicitor General, a judge who had sat upon the bench at the great state trial of Daniel O'Connell some years before, and a man known beyond the law for his advocacy of total abstinence from drink and for a reputation, among his contemporaries, for probity and Christian gravity of temper. It was he who would deliver the judgment of the court upon its close. For the Crown appeared Mr. Smiley, Queen's Counsel, with Mr. Edward Hayes, Queen's Counsel, and Mr. Pennyfather. For the defence of the prisoner appeared Mr. Isaac Butt, Queen's Counsel and Member of Parliament, a barrister of the first distinction, whose name would afterward be remembered in the wholly separate field of Irish politics, but who was in that courtroom simply the ablest advocate the prisoner could have retained, together with Mr. Walter Burke, Queen's Counsel, and others. The court was densely crowded on both days. The case had by now the character of a public sensation, its every particular canvassed in the newspapers, and the interest turned quite as much upon the exposure of the prisoner's double life as upon the question of how his wife had died. The prisoner himself was respectably dressed, sat composed, and betrayed little. The case for the Crown was built up in an order that the record allows us to set out plainly. There was, first, the matter of the discovery, the crossing to the island, the last sight of the living woman as she went to bathe, the cries heard across the water at Howth, the finding of the body upon the rocks of the Long Hole, and the wet sheet lying near it. There was, second, the domestic history, the marriage, the second household, the woman known as Mrs. Kirwan, the 7 children, and the quarrels that neighbours professed to have overheard. All of it advanced to supply the motive. There was, third, the medical testimony of Dr. Hatchell, to the effect that the death was by asphyxia and that the appearances exceeded those of a simple drowning. And there was, fourth, the conduct of the defendant himself, both upon the island in the hours of the search and in the arrangement of his life that the investigation had brought to light. The defence met each of these in turn. It argued that the death was an accident or the consequence of a natural seizure, that the medical evidence, given upon a body a month decayed, could not bear the weight the Crown placed upon it, that the cries heard from the shore were as consistent with a woman in distress in the water as with any act of violence, and that Kirwan could not have followed his wife into the sea to drown her, for when the boatman found him only his feet and the lower part of his clothing were wet, as they would be from walking the rain-soaked grass of the island in search of her. It was, by the standards of its day, a spirited and a substantial defence, and upon the medical question in particular, it had much of the science of the age behind it. It did not succeed, and the reason it did not succeed is written plainly across the case, and was acknowledged even by those close to the verdict. The evidence that convicted William Kirwan was not, in the end, the evidence of the manner of the death, which remained genuinely in doubt. It was the evidence of the manner of his life. The exposure of the second household, in the moral atmosphere of the time, made of him a man the jury were prepared to believe capable of the act. And it is difficult, reading the record now, to separate the finding of guilt from the finding of immorality. After a trial that ran late into its second night, the jury returned, near to midnight, their verdict. William Burke Kirwan was found guilty of the wilful murder of Sarah Maria Louisa Kirwan. Before sentence, Mr. Butt rose to raise objections upon points of evidence, that the testimony concerning the mistress ought never to have been admitted, and that certain of the medical evidence was improperly received, and sought leave to carry these to a higher court. But there existed at that time no court of criminal appeal to which such objections could be taken as of right. The avenue that a later century would regard as elementary did not exist, and the points, however weighty, had nowhere to go. Mr. Justice Crampton then pronounced sentence. He took up the black cap. He addressed the prisoner at some length and with evident solemnity, reproaching him that he had raised his hand against a woman, a hapless and unprotected woman who by the laws of God and of man had been entitled to his protection and his affection, and speaking, for the benefit of the young who might be listening, of the gradual descent by which one immoral step leads to the next, until the last and fatal step is reached. He held out no hope of reprieve. He passed upon William Kirwan the sentence of death by hanging. The sentence of death was not carried out. This is the point at which the case departs from the pattern that its opening seemed to promise, and it is the point that has kept it alive as a matter of controversy for the better part of 2 centuries. Almost as soon as the verdict was known, a movement began to save the condemned man, and it drew its strength precisely from the doubt that the trial had failed to dispel. The affidavits and opinions were gathered and published. The solicitor John Boswell assembled them and put them before the public in a pamphlet, setting out the defense of the convicted man, and they were reprinted widely in the newspapers. The memorial of the 10 eminent physicians was pressed. A clergyman, a Reverend Mallet, produced the written testimony of Maria's own mother that Kirwan had been a kind husband to her daughter, and the reservations reached even into the jury that had convicted him. Its foreman afterward wrote to the newspapers to say that the minds of the jurymen had been much relieved by the commutation, and it was said, by a commentator who had studied the case closely, that but for what the prisoner's married life had been shown to be, the jury would never have agreed upon their verdict at all. Under the accumulating weight of this doubt, the executive government commuted the sentence. The penalty of death was set aside, and in its place, Kirwan was ordered to penal servitude, transportation for life. That the commutation was owed to public pressure was charged at the time, and the charge was thought grave enough that the Under-Secretary, John Wynne, took the unusual course of defending the decision in a public letter, in which he affirmed that the Lord Lieutenant had neither solicited nor received the advice of any person in the matter. Whatever moved it, the effect was settled. The man convicted of murder would not hang, but neither would he go free. He was held first, and for the greater part of his term, upon Spike Island, in the harbour of Cork, the fortified prison island to which the convicts of that period were sent. For a time he was removed further, to Bermuda, where the British held convicts in the hulks and upon the works. An army officer stationed there, Ferdinand Whittingham, recorded in a book published in 1857 that among the prisoners at Boaz Island was the painter Kirwan, sentenced some years before for the murder of his wife at Island's Eye, saved from the gallows chiefly by the exertions of the press, and maintaining still that no justice had been done him, for, as he put it, if guilty, he ought to have been hanged, and if innocent, he ought to have been set at liberty. It was observed that he was treated with some leniency, being employed at light duties and spared the hardest labour, in part on account of a troublesome leg. The length of his imprisonment is given differently in the sources. Some say 24 years, some 25, some 27, the disagreement turning, as so much in this case turns, upon exactly how the years are reckoned and from what point. What is fixed is the end of it. In January of the year 1879, William Burke Kirwan was released from custody, an old man, having spent the whole middle of his life in confinement for a death, whose cause the profession of medicine had never agreed upon. He made no confession upon his release, as he had made none in all the years between. He had confessed nothing indeed, at any point from his arrest onward, and the account he gave of himself never varied. Of his life after 1879, the record grows thin and uncertain once more. It was reported that he was recognized by some about the streets of Dublin in the period after his release, and it has been variously said that he left for America and rejoined the woman and the children of his second household, though the particulars are not firmly established, and the date and place of his death are not securely fixed, falling somewhere about the year 1880. So the legal proceedings, opened by an inquest verdict of accidental drowning and carried through a capital conviction to a commutation and a quarter-century of penal servitude, came at last to their quiet and inconclusive close. The case did not leave the record when Kirwan left the prison. It had been, from the first, a matter argued in print as much as in court, and the printing did not stop. The trial was reported in full and published. The pamphlet literature defending the prisoner circulated widely, and in the decades that followed, the case was taken up again and again by the writers who chronicle notable trials. It found its place in Matthias MacDonald Bodkin's collection of famous Irish trials early in the 20th century, and in the work of the great Scottish analyst of crime William Roughead, who was drawn, as students of the case are always drawn, to the unresolved medical question at its heart. In our own time, it has been the subject of book-length study by Dean Ruxton in a work that recovered the case for a modern readership from the archive of a Dublin newspaper, and by Michael Sheridan in another. Above all, it survived where such cases most matter, in the law itself, and in the argument about how a man may justly be convicted. For the Kirwan case became, almost at once, a standing illustration in the long debate over circumstantial evidence, the question of when a chain of inference, no single link of which is a witness to the act, may be permitted to hang a man. A pamphlet published in the immediate aftermath took the case as its very text, arguing that it illustrated the danger of conviction upon circumstantial evidence and the necessity of granting new trials in criminal cases. And that second point struck at a real defect, that Kirwan, convicted upon contested evidence and by objections that a later age would have heard on appeal, had in 1852 no court to hear them, is part of the case's lasting significance, for the want of a proper avenue of criminal appeal in that period was among the grievances that would in time be remedied. The case is remembered then not as a settled crime, but as a warning, a place where the machinery of justice reached a verdict that the science of the day would not underwrite, and that the conscience of the public would not accept, and reached it, many believed, because the man in the dock had been shown to be an adulterer before he had been shown to be a murderer. And in all of this, the pamphlets, the appeals, the medical memorials, the books, the long argument over evidence and appeal, it is difficult not to notice how far the woman herself has receded. The case is called by his name and not by hers. It is the doubt about his guilt and not the fact of her death that has kept it in the record. She survives in the literature very largely as the occasion of a famous controversy, rather than as a person who lived 24 years and was loved by her mother and painted, perhaps, in a straw hat by the man who would be tried for her killing. That she has become, in the memory of the case, an occasion and not a person is the one quiet sorrow this account will permit itself to name. The straw-hatted portrait, if it is truly hers, is among the few things of her that remain. It hangs now in a national collection, and it looks out past us at nothing we can see. The case of Sarah Maria Louisa Kirwan was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was entered, the sentence of death was pronounced and then set aside, and the manner of her death was never established beyond doubt. The case became part of the national record. It has not left.